Hi and welcome to Tabletop Mini Showcase. I'm Jim, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how I restored and painted this dope as funk Oldhammer Whirlwind, and how doing so kind of helps to remind me of a day that pretty much changed my life. Let's get to it. If you're looking to build your own whirlwind like this, the colours that I've used can be substituted for the colours of pretty much any army, as the techniques that I've used are pretty universal in their application. So whether you want to zuck things up with some meta marines or get elbow deep into some imperial fisting, the tips and techniques that you see in this video should still be applicable. But of course, if you do pick one of these up second hand, the condition and number of missing components can vary, so be prepared to put in quite a lot of work if you want it to look anything like the kits that were originally released by Games Workshop when these kits were first put on the market. The Whirlwind that I have was bought second hand, and it did have quite a number of missing parts and surface damage, but with a bit of effort, some green stuff, brass rods, wood filler, plastic tubes and cardboard, I was able to make new parts that are pretty close approximations of the original bits, and I was also able to get the warping under control and have the whole thing fit together nicely. I chose to make the parts rather than buying them off of eBay, as the cost of buying replacement parts would have been pretty much the same as what it would have been to buy an entire new Whirlwind, and since it didn't really make sense to either spend that money on parts or buy an entire new tank and just basically rob Peter to pay Paul by taking bits from one tank to fix another, I figured the best way to get this tank back in action would be to simply make the parts myself. And since the lore of the successor chapter that I have created, the Honoured Scions, involves the army salvaging parts and repurposing things found on the battlefield, I figured this DIY approach is quite in keeping with the philosophy of my 40k Green Boys. I kept the rockets and the main body of the tank separate, as this will allow me to get the brush into all the hard to reach little areas, and it also makes it easier for me to airbrush the main body of the tank and the rockets without having to mask anything off. If you've used putties or fillers, I'd recommend you actually prime the Mini with a proper primer rather than just using some sort of acrylic paint if you really want the appearance to be seamless. An actual primer designed for model kits would be best, but in this instance I really just wanted to get the model primed quickly, and so a rattle can was just a lot easier. Also, the slight texture that rattle cans tend to create was actually quite beneficial in this situation, as it helped to mask all of the many surface imperfections that this miniature had. Next up, I added some Warpstone green to my airbrush and diluted it down to a consistency that is thin enough to spray, but not so thin that it will take 24 coats to get adequate coverage, and I base coated the body of the tank. At this point, my airbrush decided to stop working, which is of course exactly what I needed in the middle of a project like this. Thanks airbrush, you f***ing dickhead. Now obviously I do want the tank to look like it fits in with the rest of my army, so I want to have the colours and ratio of colours to be roughly the same on my vehicles as it is on my troops. And with my troops, those colours are predominantly green with red and white accents.
Ha! What are you painting? Christmas Marines?
Actually, I'm painting them the same colours as the Marines my cousin gave me when I was a child. I didn't have a lot of minis back then, so he very generously gave me his old army, and since his kindness is something that honestly had a pretty profound impact on me, I decided to honour his army by continuing to use their colours, and as a result, whenever I look at my current Marines, I'm reminded of something beautiful that someone who loves me once did for me. What are you doing? Auditioning for a f***ing Mean Girls remake?
You're wearing sweatpants. It's Monday.
So?
So that's against the rules, and you can't sit with us.
Whatever.
I used a brush to add black to the areas that would be painted in silver in order to give them a good base to build off. I also added it to the areas that just simply needed to be black, and then dry brush silver onto the grills and other metal areas before moving on to painting the red, white and other accents around the tank. In order to get a good smooth finish, I thinned my paint with water to a thinner than usual consistency and used many thin coats until I had a good opacity. The usual consistency people aim for when painting base coats on minis is around the consistency of milk, but as these are really large flat areas, the potential for there to be noticeable brush strokes is quite high, so aiming for a consistency that is a little thinner and applying multiple thin coats that are more likely to level off naturally seemed like the safest bet in this circumstance. I then used black panel liner to create shading around the model, and at this point you could be excused for thinking I'd gone mental and ruined the paint work I'd done, but the reality is that when it comes to painting there are always ugly stages where things look messy or bad, but working through these steps adds character and gives the model depth that it otherwise would lack. I guess in a way you could say that the painting process is kinda similar to life in that way. I allowed the panel liner to dry for around 24 hours as it takes considerably longer to dry than acrylic paint, and I wanted to be sure it was thoroughly set before moving on to the next step. So once I was sure the panel liner had fully cured, I went around the model reapplying the base coat over the surfaces where I wanted the model to appear clean and left the darker areas in the recesses to act as the shading. This gives the model a lot more definition, allowing all of those smaller details to be seen clearly from a distance. I then went around the tank edge highlighting all of the edges with a lighter tone and further lightening the tone to edge highlight the corners and areas that I wanted to stand out, such as the middle of the longer edges. I used two different tones as it just adds an extra level of realism, and since I'm only applying the lightest highlights to a select few areas, it really doesn't take that long. I realise for some people edge highlighting can be seen as overly intricate and fiddly, but for me it's actually a really relaxing process, and the overall difference it makes to the look of a mini can be pretty drastic as it really allows the details to pop and read in a way that provides definition which is significantly more clear than if the mini was left to just use natural lighting circumstances in order to define its shapes. I used fluorescent paints for the front and rear lights as I wanted them to appear really bright as if glowing, but I didn't want to use any kind of OSL effect as I personally feel that most of the OSL effects I've seen on older tanks such as this don't really sell the idea that well and tend to look a little forced. So for me this was a good alternative. In low lights the fluorescent paint really stands out, similar to the reflector on bicycles or health and safety clothing, and it really adds to the look in a way that is simple to achieve. The fluorescents I used were fluorescent Posca paint pens. The pens use acrylic paints, they have a really bright finish, and there's several colours available. Their coverage can be a little weak, but from what I understand most fluorescents suffer with this issue, so I guess applying several coats is the only way to get a solid look regardless of what brand you use. For the cases on the back of the tank, I wanted to go with leather so as to match the leather satchels and holsters on my Marines. I know leather cases on a tank may seem weird, but I figure they could be steel cases with leather coverings, and since it's commonplace to see hazard stripes, a pattern that is literally designed to be visible and prevent injuries used on tanks and weapons in this universe, I figured the rule of cool rules over any real world logic. So any complaints can be written on a postcard and mailed to I don't give a fuck land, because I don't give a fuck. Alright, so fucking drop it. Don't make me bring up the wolfen. My go-to method of painting leather is simply start with Scrag Brown and add a bunch of Agraxite shade in a patchy uneven manner in several layers until dark. I then add a rough looking edge highlight of Scrag Brown around the edge and lots of scratchy lines over the surface. I concentrate more Scrag Brown around the corners or areas where the leather would take more heavy wear, and then add a very minute amount of Cadian flesh tone into the centre of those areas. My rule for these kind of things is generally you want a minimum of 3 colours, as our eyes will quickly recognise 2 colours as being unrealistic. The third colour, even when used sparsely, will help to sell the look of realism. Maybe it's to do with how our brain is programmed to see shadow, mid-tone and light in a three-dimensional world, or some shit like that. I don't know, I'm not a psychologist. I just know it helps to have 3 levels of colour wherever possible. So that's what I do. I then applied decals around the tank using microset to help hold them in place. I didn't bother with micro sol as it really doesn't do much to help when applying decals to flat surfaces. In fact, in my experience, it just tends to make the decals unset from the position and become difficult to realign without causing creases or having the decal get folded in on itself. If you're putting decals on shoulder pads or curved surfaces, sure it can help, but if not, personally I avoid using it. Since my airbrush was out of commission, I next applied a coat of Liquitex matte varnish from a rattle can, which I now realise is basically like kicking your paint job in the bollocks repeatedly with a supercharged robot leg whilst wearing steel toe capped boots, as my god that stuff is dog shit, I mean seriously. The finish was cloudier than a hipster's tent at an annual vaping convention held during a British winter. I had to scrub at the entire thing with an old paintbrush and water for about an hour to get rid of that varnish, and that led to me losing 2 decals and having to repaint the front panels on the tank, as well as having all of my metallics dulled down. I basically got butt fucked from all angles thanks to that nefarious can of wanky spud water. Not a sponsor, yeah. Liquitex Rattle Can Matte Varnish. It's a big thumbs down from me. Really do not recommend. Unless of course the finish that you're looking for is a varnish that looks like it's got a fucking yeast infection. I reapplied the decals to the front of the tank, but held off on varnishing until my airbrush was fixed this time. And while I was waiting for the new part I needed to get my airbrush back in the game, I focused on getting the rockets for the tank ready for paint. One of the rockets was missing the back piece, and since finding this specific part in a single auction is about as likely as GW having a 4th of July sale, I decided to build a new bit myself out of green stuff and the tube from a paintbrush end. It was a bit of a faff about, but the end result is pretty decent, and once painted it should be more or less indistinguishable from the original part, unless you know to look for it. The rockets in general were pretty banged up with dings and scrapes all over them, so I can only assume that the guy who sold them to me had been storing them in an actual war zone, considering the condition of them. But I did my best to smooth them out with some green stuff and filler, and got them presentable enough to be used on my tank. I then gave the rockets a spray of primer in order to unify the starting point, and went on to base coat them and highlight them in the usual manner, using glazes of progressively lighter colours. Nothing crazy or groundbreaking, just the usual 2 thin coats followed by shading and highlighting approach that I use for pretty much all of my paintwork. But hey, if it works it works. Why fix something if it ain't broke? Jog on Bob, you fucking hard out wanker. With the rockets complete, I glued them into place and hit the entire thing with some ultra matte Lucky Varnish by Ammo with my now functioning airbrush. I know an airbrush may seem like a fancy schmancy tool, but if all you're going to use it for is undercoating, base coating and varnishing, you can get away with using a 30 quid airbrushing compressor from off of eBay, and it'll probably end up saving you money down the line in comparison to what it would cost to do the same job with rattle cans. Plus, as you've seen here, it gives you access to better products, as the varnishes that are available here in the UK at least are pretty gash, to be honest, whereas the Ultra Matte Lucky Varnish by Ammo is a pretty good product. With everything assembled and the varnish applied, I highlighted the metallics to give them back their shine, added a little pigment powder to the tank tracks to match with my army's basing scheme, and called it good. And there we have it, one Oldhammer Whirlwind complete and ready for action. It may not be perfect, but the feeling of joy that I get from restoring models like this that are kinda worse for wear and in need of some TLC is really rewarding. Giving this tank a new lease on life and allowing it to finally reach its potential was a really fun journey, and the memories and emotions that these old kits can bring out in people is something pretty special. For me, looking at this tank takes me back to being 13 years old, spending time with my mum and dad at my auntie's house, and having my big cousin give me more models than I could have ever dreamt of having. It reminds me of just how much that day affected me and how it taught me the importance of being a caring and supportive person, and the responsibility we each have to be kind-hearted and thoughtful towards others. Because at the end of the day, we really have no idea just how much one small gesture can mean to someone, and how much that one gesture can influence the rest of their life. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I hope for some of you it's been a bit of a walk down memory lane. If you want to support me and see more content like this, you can do so 100% for free by hitting the like, share and subscribe button and turning on notifications. That way you'll never miss any of my uploads. Your support means a lot to me, and I read every comment, so if you have any questions or you just want to say hi, put it down in the comments below. I love reading your comments, and I always do my best to get back to everyone. If you're deep into a YouTube rabbit hole right now and you're looking for other videos to watch, here's a couple that you might find interesting. And until next time, in a bizzle. Action!